how would you explain hypertrophy? And then what does that style of training look like in terms of rep schemes, training volume? How heavy are you lifting? Give us the sauce.
Yeah. So hypertrophy is the increase in muscle size. That's literally how it's defined. And kind of related to hypertrophy is hyperplasia, which is increasing the number of muscle fibers that you have. And that's not something that is done super commonly. There was actually a really cool study from the 90s where they took quail and they tied really light weights to the end of their wings and just let them like flap around and live life. And they actually saw hyperplasia, which is the increase of actual number of muscle fibers. But what we do in our training is mostly going to be hypertrophy, which is the increase of muscle size. So as when we go about training for hypertrophy, the keys are a few things. I think first thing to understand, and the first thing I would tell Lori from 2017 is that your muscle only knows tension. And so this is an important distinction between strength and hypertrophy, because in strength, strength is a skill. Like it sounds silly to say that, like strength is a skill, and hypertrophy is not a skill. But essentially, what you're trying to do in strength is be the most efficient you can to move weight from point A to point B. You don't care what muscles are doing that job. You just want to be as efficient as you can. Neuromuscular efficiency would be the term. And so this is part of why you see people that aren't even that big or muscular that are really, really, really strong, because their bodies are just primed in such a way and they're so good at this skill of performing these movements that they can lift really heavy, even though they're maybe not as big as bodybuilders. On the alternative side, we have hypertrophy training, which following this idea of the muscle only knows tension. That's actually one of the things that I love the most about it, because you don't need to lift heavy weights. Like you do need progressive overload. So that is maybe the biggest confusing factor, is that people think, oh, well, if it's hypertrophy, I just need to think about mind muscle connection and it doesn't really matter how much weight I'm lifting. And that is not exactly true, because if you're doing progressive overload, you are caring about how much weight you lift. You have to think of, yep.
Can you explain what progressive overload is? Just for people who don't really know.
Yeah. No, good call. So progressive overload essentially just means that you're doing more the next week than you were doing the prior week. And that doesn't mean, like most people think progressive overload means I have to add a rep or I have to add weight to have progressive overload occur. In fact, progressive overload can be achieved in a number of ways. It can be achieved through slowing your tempo down. It can be achieved through pausing in different positions of the movement. It can be achieved through just performing the movement better. So there's like a number of different ways that you can even increase volume. Like that's probably a hammer. Like if you have the different options of ways you could increase the stimulus, adding a set is like, whoa, that's like a whole ton. Cause usually, like, oh, let's just try to add a rep or add 5 pounds. But if you add a whole set, well, that's like a huge hammer. Mm-hmm. So that's not something that we use very often, but it is like another tool in this toolbox. And so, hypertrophy just has, like I was saying, this malleable approach where there's so many different ways to roam. And with that knowledge of your muscle only knows tension, the cool thing about hypertrophy is that as long as your form remains consistent week to week, the progressive overload is there's like this theoretical or philosophical view of progressive overload where it's like a chicken and the egg thing. So it's like, do I have to add weight to the bar or add reps or somehow do something so that progressive overload occurs? Or am I adding weight and adding reps because I got stronger and therefore I have to now do more weight or more reps, or else the stimulus won't be enough? And so you can kind of conceptualize that by thinking about like, hey, if I'm squatting 200 pounds and I do 10 reps, what if I just did 200 pounds for 10 reps forever? And I never tried to do 11 reps. I never tried to do 205 pounds. I just always did 200 pounds for 10. Well, eventually that 10 reps would be too easy. And so progressive overload would be recognizing that 200 by 10 is no longer stimulative. And so what can I do to make sure that 200, or to make sure that it's still stimulative? Well, I can add weight, or I can add reps, or I can add pauses, or I can do all of these number of things that I talked about.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I think there's so many good things there, because it's like, for me personally, coming from the CrossFit background of all that matters is how much weight did you lift? How fast did you do it? We don't care about, how it looks. We just care what's the weight on your bar, how many reps, what is the end result? And so it's truly, it's like here I am so many years removed from CrossFit, but I think that one of the things I struggled with most during hypertrophy cycles. Like I used to, it's like, I remember specifically, it was like during the Panini, like there was a strength cycle, Alex and I are smashing weight. And it's like, we would get so excited for strength cycles. And then reversely, with hypertrophy, we see higher rep schemes. Strength is like the kind of 1 to 6 reps, with lots of triples or doubles or 5 sets of 5 sort of thing, where it's like hypertrophy is, well, 10 to 12 reps, 12 to 15 reps. And so I would always struggle to pick my weight. Like I would choose violence. And, it was like I didn't know how to turn off my ego because again, it was like that was the puzzle piece I was missing was it was like, hey, like, yes, your lift sets need to be difficult. But no, you don't need to be redlining. You don't need to be, it's like the most common thing that would happen was, it's like, I would come out hot at the beginning of the training cycle. And then, by week 4 or 5 or 6, you would be like, oh, well, I've only been adding like 2.5 pounds, but I'm definitely not, I wasn't hitting the intended, like stimulus there because it was like, I just didn't get it. So I think that's so important to understand is it's like with hypertrophy training, things are still difficult. And, yes, you might be meeting Jesus during your lift sets, but it's a different kind of difficult than like, hey, okay, like I'm trying to move as much weight as humanly freaking possible.
Yeah. Let me just clarify one thing real quick, because I think what you're getting at is this idea of systemic fatigue. So like fatigue throughout your body as a system. And so I remember clearly when I talked to Jason Phillips about taking you on back in like 2017 or whatever, one of the things he pointed out was like, after these workouts, you were really struggling to like sit down and focus and do work and stuff like that. And so that's one of these signs of high systemic fatigue. And so when you first started with me and we were doing more hypertrophy style training and you were still tied to those numbers that you were lifting before, you were now lifting in hypertrophy rep ranges. So you were doing 8 to 12, 10 to 15, whatever that is. But because you were treating them still as if they were strength lifts, that the systemic fatigue that you're feeling from these movements is still almost as prominent as it was when you were doing CrossFit. And so when you're doing hypertrophy training in the ideal optimal way, we actually want to limit or as much as possible eliminate systemic fatigue so that the fatigue that we're feeling is in the peripheral system, which would essentially be your local muscles. So it's like, my quads are smashed or my glutes are smashed, but like my general sense of being, it still feels like fully intact and I'm able to function,